Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today we're taking a look at the work of Roberto Bolaño,
And Jorge Luis Borges.
two giants of Latin American literature.
That's right.
We've got some excerpts from two really interesting articles.
Bolaño como B de Borges?
Yes, and Las otras apropiaciones de Borges y Bolaño,
Right.
to help us explore the connections between these two authors.
Yeah, and I think listeners are going to be surprised by some of the stuff we uncover.
Oh yeah, it's not all straightforward literary analysis.
No, not at all.
There's some intrigue in there.
Definitely, I'd say admiration, but also a bit of tension between these two figures.
Yeah, well, and right away, Bolaño como de Borges talks about Borges as like Bolaño's North Star, even going so far as to call Borges the center of our canon.
Wow.
I mean, what a statement, right?
It is a big statement, yeah.
What do you think Bolaño meant by that?
Well, it seems to me like he's saying that Borges is the standard, the writer that all other writers should aspire to. And by extension, it kind of tells us what Bolaño valued as a writer himself.
Yeah, what he thought was important.
Exactly.
So both of these guys were incredibly well-read, self-taught, and just prolific writers.
Yeah, turned out an incredible amount of work.
And they both really loved poetry, too.
Yeah, you don't always see that.
Right. Not with famous novelists.
Especially these days. It's more rare.
Yeah, so it's interesting, and it's even kind of eerie when you think about all the parallels in their lives.
Oh, yeah, like living abroad.
Yeah.
And participating in all these influential literary movements.
It's almost like they were mirror images of each other, but
separated by time.
separated by time.
Yeah.
But, okay, so here's the thing. They never actually met.
Really?
Yeah.
I had no idea.
Can you believe that?
These two literary giants so connected, but their paths never crossed.
It just makes you wonder what a conversation between them would have been like.
Right, can you imagine?
Oh, man.
I bet they would have gotten along, famously.
Or maybe they would have hated each other.
Haha, that's true too.
Yeah, that would have been something.
It would have, yeah.
But speaking of connections,
Yeah.
both Bolaño and Borges really love to blur the lines between truth and fiction in their work.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like, take Borges' Historia Universal della Infaimia.
Okay.
He mixes actual historical figures with completely made-up details.
Right, so you never really know what to believe.
Exactly.
It makes you question everything.
Like, do you think he was trying to say that history itself is just a kind of fiction?
That's a great question.
Right.
It's very Borgesian.
It is.
To make you question the very nature of what you think is true.
And then Bolaño does something very similar in La Literatura Nazi in America.
Oh, yes.
Where he creates this whole fictional encyclopedia about Nazi writers.
It's so detailed.
Right.
You almost believe it's real.
Yeah, it really makes you question everything you read.
Uh-huh.
And I think that's part of what makes both of these authors' work so captivating.
I agree.
But it does also raise some interesting ethical questions, doesn't it?
Yeah, for sure. Like,
how far can you go?
how far is too far
Right.
with mixing fact and fiction before it becomes
A problem.
an ethical problem?
Yeah, or before it, misleads people.
Right.
Or, whatever.
I think about that a lot, actually.
Yeah.
Like, what's the responsibility of a writer?
Right.
Is it just to entertain, or do they have some kind of obligation to stick to the truth?
That's a tough one.
It is. Yeah, and, it's not just about facts and stuff like that.
Okay.
They both really went all in on fictional books and authors, too.
Yeah, Borges was famous for that.
Oh, yeah.
Like, in Acercamiento an Motassem.
Right?
He builds this whole story
Yeah.
around a book that doesn't even exist.
By an author that doesn't exist.
By an author he made up.
It's incredible.
And then he did it again with Herbert Quain.
Right? Even wrote a whole essay analyzing Quain's imaginary work.
Yeah, it's like he created these whole literary universes.
And then Bolaño did the same thing in La Literatura Nazi in America.
Okay.
With all these in-depth reviews of authors that he just completely made up.
It's what do you think was the point of going to all that trouble?
I think it shows how fascinated they both were with the power of storytelling.
Okay.
Like, they're showing us how fiction can change how we see the world, how it can even make us question what we think we know is real.
Yeah, it's like they're playing with us.
A little bit, yeah.
And speaking of playing with the reader,
Okay.
both Bolaño and Borges love to use this kind of detective element in their writing.
Oh, yeah. Turning the reader into a sleuth.
Like in Bolaño's Estrella Distante, the narrator's trying to piece together this puzzle about a fascist poet, using all these little bits of information from letters and archives.
I love that.
And it reminds me so much of Borges' Seis Problemas para Don Isidro Parodi.
Where the prisoner solves crimes from his jail cell.
Exactly.
Using his knowledge of literature.
Yeah, why do you think that detective element is so appealing to readers?
Well, I think it just pulls you in. Makes you feel like you're part of the story.
Yeah.
Like you're helping to uncover the mystery.
Okay, and while we're on the topic of shared interests,
Uh-huh.
we have to talk about the gaucho.
Ah, yes, the iconic figure of the Pampas.
Bolaño's El Gaucho en su Fable really explores this
Okay.
with a protagonist who's obsessed with Borges,
Aha, however.
and he's trying to live out this romanticized gaucho life.
Right.
It's hilarious and also kind of tragic at the same time.
Yeah, I see that.
Which totally reminded me of Borges El Sur,
Oh, yeah.
where the main character kind of embraces this idealized vision of life on the Pampas.
Interesting.
Do you think Bolaño was intentionally playing with Borges themes there?
Well, it's definitely open to interpretation.
Okay.
Could be an homage to Borges.
Uh-huh.
Or maybe even a subtle critique.
It definitely adds another layer to their relationship as writers.
It does, yeah.
We'll have to keep digging to see what else we can uncover.
Let's do it.
It really highlights how writers are always influencing each other, right?
It's like this ongoing conversation across generations.
Yeah, and then you've got Ricardo Piglia arguing that Borges's fiction didn't just reflect reality, but actually shaped it.
Wow, that's powerful.
I know, right?
What do you think of that? Well, it adds a whole new layer to his legacy, doesn't it?
It does.
Like he wasn't just writing stories, he was creating worlds.
Yeah, and those worlds actually had an impact on the real world.
Exactly. His ideas influenced the way people thought about things.
Okay, and that brings us to this idea of literary appropriation.
Yes, which is a big theme in Las otras apropiaciones de Borges y Bolaño.
Right. The article argues that both Bolaño and Borges were really good at taking existing ideas and transforming them into something new.
It's a fascinating concept.
It is, and it's so relevant today with all this remixing and reinterpreting we see everywhere.
Yeah, it's
So all of this gets even more interesting when we start talking about the role of the widows.
Ah, yes, the keepers of the flame.
Right, because they played a huge role in shaping the legacies of these two literary giants.
For better or worse, some might say.
Well, yeah, things get a little complicated there.
To say the least.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit.
Okay, so Las otras apropiaciones de Borges y Bolaño focuses on Maria Kodama Borges' widow
Right.
and Carolina Lopez Bolaño's widow.
Okay.
And they both faced a lot of criticism for how they've managed their husband's work.
Like what kind of criticism?
Well, there have been accusations about publishing unfinished material, conflicts of interest, using their position for personal gain,
Right.
and even legal battles over how other people are allowed to use Borges and Bolaño's writing.
Wow, so it's a real mess.
It is, yeah, a tangled web of copyright law and artistic freedom.
Yeah, and the whole question of what you do with an artist's work after they die.
It's a big question.
It is who gets to decide what happens to it.
Right, is it the family, the publishers, the critics, or even the public?
I don't know, what do you think?
Well, it's a tough one, but I think it's important to remember that these widows have also done a lot to keep these authors' work in the public eye.
Okay, how so?
Well, they've organized events, authorized translations, and made sure that new generations have access to these books.
That's true.
So it's a complex situation.
Yeah, it is.
With no easy answers.
It's a reminder that there are always these different perspectives.
Exactly. And to see how this plays out in the real world, let's look at the case of Maria Kodama and the controversy surrounding El Hacedor de Borges remake.
Okay, so this was a pretty unique project, right?
It was Agustín Fernández Malo took every single piece from Borges' El Hacedor.
Like stories, essays, poems, the whole thing.
The whole thing, and reinterpreted them, creating his own version of the book.
Wow, that's bold.
It was, but as you might imagine, Kodama, who controls the rights to Borges' work, was not happy.
I bet not.
Her lawyers shut it down.
Really?
Yeah, the publisher had to pull all the copies from circulation.
So the book exists, but you can't find it.
Basically, yeah, it's a collector's item now.
Wow, and this wasn't the only time Kodama's legal team went after someone for messing with Borges' work.
Oh no, there was also the case of Pablo Cachagian and his book El Aleph Engordado.
The Fattened Aleph will love that title.
Me too. It's great. So Cachagian took Borges' famous short story El Aleph and just added a bunch of text to it.
He basically supersized it.
Exactly, made it longer and more complex.
And Kodama's lawyers weren't too happy about that either.
Nope, they argued that it was a form of fraud.
Fraud.
Yeah, they said he was damaging Borges' legacy and potentially profiting from unauthorized use of his work.
So they took him to court.
They did? Can you imagine being on that jury?
I know, right? Trying to decide if adding words to a story is a crime.
It really shows the clash between traditional ideas about copyright and the more fluid remix culture we live in today.
Yeah, it's a tough one. Where do you draw the line between inspiration, homage, and infringement?
Exactly. And this whole issue of appropriation isn't limited to Borges.
Right. The article also talks about Carolina Lopez and some of the controversy surrounding her management of Bolaño's estate.
Especially when it comes to publishing his unfinished novels.
Like El Tercer Reich, Los Sinsabores de Verdadera Policía, and El Espíritu de la Ciencia Ficción.
Right, those were all works in progress, not necessarily what Bolaño would have considered final polished pieces.
And some people argue that publishing them as standalone novels instead of as part of a collection of unfinished work misrepresents them.
Yeah, it makes it seem like they're complete and polished when they might not be.
And there's also been some discussion about the decision to publish these with major commercial publishers.
Rather than going through academic channels.
Right. The argument is that it prioritizes making money over scholarly rigor.
The article even suggests that maybe someone like Ignacio Echevarria, a well-respected critic and editor, would have been a better choice to oversee Bolaño's literary legacy.
Interesting. So maybe the best choice for his children wasn't necessarily the best choice for his work?
It's possible, yeah. It's all about balancing those personal and professional considerations.
And to make things even messier, there are the personal conflicts that have emerged.
Ah, yes, specifically between Lopez and Carmen Perez Bolaño's last partner.
Yeah, the article mentions some serious bad blood there.
Apparently, Lopez's lawyers have even threatened legal action against anyone who mentions Perez in connection with Bolaño.
Wow, so much drama.
It's like a literary soap opera.
It is, and it brings us back to this question of appropriation.
Okay.
Do you think it's possible that these widows are, in their own way, engaging in a form of literary appropriation?
That's an interesting thought.
Right.
The article compares them to the artist Sherry Levine, who famously rephotographed works by Walker Evans.
Which caused a huge controversy about authorship and originality.
Exactly. And then there's Jose Manuel Ballester, who digitally removes the figures from classic paintings.
So it's like he's erasing the original artist.
In a way, yeah, creating these empty spaces that are both beautiful and unsettling.
Do you see any parallels there with what Kodama and Lopez are doing?
I do. Yeah, it makes you wonder if they're trying to exert a similar kind of control over the narrative.
Like they're shaping their husbands' legacies to fit their own visions.
It's like they're saying, we hold the keys to these literary kingdoms, and we decide which stories get told.
Wow, that's powerful, but as the article points out, the dead can be pretty indomitable.
That's true. Their legacies often escape even the most determined attempts at control.
So it all comes back to this question of how we responsibly engage with the work of artists who are no longer with us.
Exactly. How do we balance respect for their intentions with the inevitable evolution of interpretation and reimagining that happens over time?
Yeah, those are important questions for all of us to think about.
Whether we're readers, critics, or just inheritors of these rich literary traditions.
And this whole exploration of Bolaño and Borges, their connections, their contradictions, and the complexities surrounding their legacies really highlights how literature can spark these important conversations.
Absolutely. It reminds us that literature isn't static.
Right.
It's a living, breathing thing that evolves as each new generation encounters it and finds new meaning within its pages.
I love that. And that brings us back to those widows, the self-proclaimed guardians of these literary treasures.
Yes.
The article mentions Kodama's book Homenage a Borges as a particularly interesting example of this appropriation in action.
It is a fascinating case study.
So what can you tell us about it? Sounds fascinating. What stood out to you?
Well, Homenage a Borges is Kodama's personal account of her life with Borges.
Okay.
You know, their relationship and how she fell in love with him and all that.
Uh-huh.
And it includes these really evocative verses.
Okay.
She writes, "I can give you my loneliness, my darkness, the hunger of my heart. I am trying to bribe you with uncertainty, with danger, with defeat."
Wow.
Pretty powerful stuff, right?
Yeah, very Borgesian.
Exactly. It's got that vulnerability and that intellectual depth.
That I love about his work.
Right. But here's the thing.
What's that?
Those exact same verses appear twice in the book. Word for word, the second time she presents them without any context.
So she's quoting Borges?
Yeah.
But acting like she wrote those lines?
That's what the article suggests.
That's crazy.
It is, right?
Like she's using his own techniques to assert her own authority over his work?
It's like meta-appropriation.
Wow. So is this like a betrayal or a clever homage?
I don't know. It's hard to say. Is it a power play or a playful game?
It's really making me think.
Me too. And I think that's what makes this whole discussion so interesting.
Yeah.
There are no easy answers.
It's all very ambiguous.
Exactly. But it forces us to confront these tough questions about authorship and ownership and interpretation.
Well, this has been a wild ride.
It has been a journey.
Bolaño and Borges, man, they really challenge you to question everything.
They do.
Truth, fiction, legacy, the whole shebang.
What do you think is the biggest takeaway for our listeners today?
I think it's this idea that literature isn't passive. You know, it's about actively engaging with these ideas, thinking critically, and maybe even getting a little uncomfortable.
I like that.
Bolaño and Borges, they invite us into their labyrinths.
Yeah.
And we have to find our own way out.
It's up to us to make sense of it all.
Exact. And speaking of finding our own way,
Yeah.
if you had to write a story inspired by both of these authors,
Okay.
what elements would you borrow from each?
Ooh, that's a tough one.
Right.
Maybe a world where detectives solve crimes using clues hidden in fictional encyclopedias,
Ooh, I like that.
or a Gaucho riding across a metaphysical pampas in search of a lost library
Okay.
filled with imaginary books.
Wow, the possibilities are endless.
They are.
And that's what makes this deep dive so rewarding.
Yeah.
It's not just about understanding Bolaño and Borges.
Right.
It's about letting their work spark our own imaginations.
And inspire us to see the world in a new way.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well said.
Well, on that note, I think it's time for us to step out of this literary labyrinth.
Back to reality.
Back to reality. But before we go, a huge thank you to you for guiding us through this fascinating world.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
We hope you enjoyed it.
We hope it sparked your curiosity and that you'll continue exploring the works of Bolaño and Borges.
There are so many treasures to be found.
Until next time, keep diving deep.